For several fleeting days, the rigid order of medieval life dissolved into pure, exhilarating chaos. A lord of mischief was chosen from among the peasants, an ordinary villager suddenly crowned with temporary authority. With a crooked wooden staff and a mischievous grin, he presided over a carnival of feasting, dancing, drinking, and delicious absurdity. Barriers between classes blurred. Peasants and nobles, usually worlds apart, found themselves laughing shoulder to shoulder beneath the smoky rafters of communal halls. Imagine the scene. Laughter rolling like thunder, violins humming over reed pipes, boots stomping on wooden floors. Cloaks spun, skirts swirled, and the cold heaviness of winter evaporated in a swirling storm of color and joy. Cups overflowed, cheeks glowed with the warmth of wine, and for a brief moment, life felt generous. Even the mischief maker, bleary-eyed, soot-covered, but radiant with the thrill of his role, issued comically grand proclamations that everyone pretended to obey. This yearly eruption of chaos, blessed by Saturn's shadow, was a spark of life in the bleakest season. But like all sparks, it was short-lived. When the feasts dwindled, when the logs smoldered into ash, and the last barrel ran dry, people trudged back to their cold huts. The laughter of St. Stephen's Day faded, replaced by the familiar silence of relentless winter. The peasants' brief reign of mischief dissolved into the same brutal reality, survival. Winter slowed time to a crawl. The earth froze so hard it seemed made of stone. Fields became useless, labor halted. With nothing left to do, people retreated indoors, huddling around dim embers, whispering prayers that the cold wouldn't claim another season's worth of lives. Daylight shrank to a thin sliver. Night stretched into an endless void, pressing on the spirit like a weight. They must have wondered if spring would ever return, or if the world had slipped permanently into ice. Yet beneath the frozen crust, life waited. Tiny green shoots, hidden deep in the soil, gathered their strength. Spring was silent, but not gone. For those who clung to hope, huddled together under the same brittle roofs, Thor would eventually return, hurling sunlight back into the sky. Blood would surge warm again. The world's pale, colorless face would blush with greens and golds. And on the first Monday after Epiphany, when the frost finally loosened its grip, the plows would carve the earth once more. The wheel of the agricultural year would begin to turn. People would emerge weak but alive, squinting into the new light. Fields would open themselves to seed. Flocks would fill the pastures with sound. Life's old dance, interrupted but never broken, would resume. But that time had not yet come. For now, winter still ruled with iron certainty. Rain fell like needles. Wind screamed through cracked shutters. Food thinned. Fires died too quickly. And every soul, young or old, peasant or lord, endured the season's cruelty side by side. Families drew comfort from their coarse cloaks, their smoky cottages, and most importantly, from one another. Together, they held on. In their huts, they listened to winter's voice, the wolf-like howl of wind, the groaning of ice, the soft whispers of their own stories. They dreamed aloud to pass the time. Dreams of gentler winters, of stronger roofs, bigger harvests, and warmer hearths. Dreams of a future where survival wasn't a yearly battle. Maybe they didn't dream so grandly. Maybe they simply held on to whatever scraps of hope they could find, believing, truly believing, that even the longest winter must eventually bow to spring. The human spirit's ability to endure such brutal conditions, year after year, is astonishing. It's impossible not to admire the medieval villagers who met each winter like a sworn enemy and emerged victorious every spring, battered but unbroken. So to the peasants who suffered, to the lords who endured, to all the unnamed souls who clung to warmth and hope in the bitter dark, we tip our hats. The deep chill had settled so profoundly over the land that even the forests seemed to hold their breath. Icicles clung to every branch like crystalline claws. Chimneys puffed thin trails of smoke that vanished quickly in the biting air. Inside their homes, People wrapped themselves in layers of coarse wool and fur, clinging to whatever warmth their stoves could produce. Yet life pulsed quietly beneath this frozen stillness. While the world slept under winter's heavy cloak, nature prepared its quiet resurrection. The streams, though trapped beneath solid ice, murmured faintly with the promise of movement. Beneath the soil, roots twitched in slow anticipation. Birds perched silently in leafless trees, waiting for the moment the sky would soften again. But these subtle movements were lost on the villagers, who only knew the harsh present. Winter was not merely a season. It was an adversary, one that demanded grit, sacrifice, and the will to endure. Inside smoky huts, families rationed their last stores of grain, praying that they would stretch far enough. Children asked when the sun would come back, and their parents, forcing optimism into tired voices, whispered soon. Old stories were retold, tales of winters far worse, when entire herds froze where they stood, when rivers cracked apart, when wolves prowled boldly into village squares. The stories were frightening, but they were also comforting. They reminded the listeners that even the worst winters had eventually released their grip. Still, the cold was not the only enemy. Darkness grew heavier. It seeped into thoughts, molded fears into shapes that couldn't be chased away by firelight. Even the strongest minds wavered under the weight of endless night. Superstitions thrived. People swore they heard spirits in the wind, omen birds circling above the empty fields, shapes moving just outside the ring of torchlight. Every sound was amplified by silence. A single twig snapping in the forest could send shivers of dread through an entire village. Wolves howled with haunting clarity across frozen valleys. Doors were barred early. Windows were shuttered tight. People prayed not only for warmth, but for protection. Yet amid all this fear, winter forged something powerful: unity. Neighbors checked on each other. Food was shared. Children crowded together under blankets, trading small treasures and whispered hopes. The poor were fed by those who had just a little more. Bonds deepened because survival depended on them. In the coldest months, human hearts often burned brightest. Still, winter spared no one. The elderly struggled to endure the bitter nights. Mothers wrapped their infants in layers of cloth, whispering lullabies to drown out the wind. Hunters ventured farther each day in search of game, often returning empty-handed. An illness lurked in every corner, coughs that wouldn't stop, fevers that came suddenly, chills that turned deadly. But hope persisted. Each dawn, the sky brightened a little earlier. Each sunset lingered a moment longer. Snow began to melt at the edges of rooftops. The first bird song pierced the silence, faint but unmistakable. People noticed. They clung to these small miracles. Then came the day, subtle yet monumental, when the earth softened underfoot. It wasn't much, just a thin layer of thaw, but it was enough to spark celebration. Children splashed in puddles. Farmers tested the soil with calloused hands. The world was waking up. Spring at long last was coming. And with it came life. People emerged from their homes with renewed vigor. Doors that had remained shut for months swung open. Tools were pulled out from storage. Animals were released from their pens and shook off the stiffness of winter. Fires that once burned merely for survival now crackled with a sense of purpose. The hardest season had passed. What remained was the ancient, hopeful cycle. The promise that no matter how brutal winter became, spring would always answer. It was a truth woven into the heart of every villager, every child, every elder who had faced seasons of hardship. Winter tests, but does not last. And with that knowledge, they stepped forward into the lengthening days, grateful for the simple gift of warmth. Spring's return did more than soften the frozen land. It awakened the human spirit. As the sun climbed higher each day, villagers stepped out into the world with a mix of relief and disbelief, as if fearing the warmth might vanish if they moved too quickly. The long winter had carved lines into their faces, dulled their eyes, and stolen much of their strength. But the promise of life breathed color back into their world. The ground, once iron-hard, yielded beneath their boots. Small green shoots broke through the thawing soil like tiny rebellions against the cold. Streams burst free from their icy prisons, rushing joyfully across stones. Birds, missing for months, returned with triumphant calls, filling the mornings with sound and motion. Life surged forward with unstoppable momentum. Fields were cleared first. It was always the fields. Men and women, shoulders stiff but determined, plowed the earth in long, sweeping lines. The soil, dark and fragrant, seemed to exhale beneath the weight of each blade. Seeds were scattered in careful patterns, handled like treasures. Every handful was a gamble, but also a prayer. Children ran between rows, chasing early butterflies, their laughter echoing across the fields. Elderly villagers sat on rough wooden benches, faces lifted toward the sun, eyes half closed in bliss. For months they had survived by candlelight and memory. Now, finally, they basked in the world returned. Animals felt the shift, too. Cows lowed eagerly as they were guided into fresh pastures. Sheep kicked their legs with sudden bursts of energy. Horses shook out their manes, stamping the earth with renewed vitality. The entire countryside hummed like a great machine waking from a long sleep. Work was backbreaking, but beautiful. A season earlier, these same people had shivered in darkness, hoping simply to stay alive. Now they worked with purpose, even joy. Sweat was a blessing compared to frostbite. Spring festivals bloomed alongside crops. Villagers erected maypoles crowned with ribbons. Lily crowns were woven by nimble fingers. Musicians tuned their lutes and fiddles, their songs drifting across the air. Wine was uncorked earlier than usual, and bread, warm, fragrant bread, was baked daily. Each celebration was a declaration. We are still here. Young men stole glances at girls gathering flowers. Grandparents told stories around bonfires. Couples danced barefoot in the grass. Laughter rose into the sky in waves, as if the very world had remembered how to breathe again. Nature responded in kind. Trees erupted with blossoms, white, pink, gold, painting the landscape in soft explosions of color. Rivers sparkled. Breezes carried the scent of earth and flowers. The air itself felt lighter, sweeter, almost forgiving. But beneath all this joy was a quieter truth. Spring was not just a return. It was revenge against winter. And yet, life in the Middle Ages was never simple. As the weeks passed and the season matured, new challenges appeared, ones that required different kinds of endurance. The moment crops were sown, worry began. Too much rain could drown the seeds. Too little would parch them. Storms could flatten fields overnight. Pests could devour entire seasons' worth of food in days. Spring brought hope, yes, but also anxiety, an uneasy awareness that survival for the next winter was already being decided. Families monitored the skies obsessively. They studied cloud shapes, wind patterns, and the behavior of animals, searching for any sign of what the season might bring. The fate of entire villages rested on forces they could not control. Yet they worked. They always worked. Sweat darkened tunics. Calluses split and bled. Backs bent beneath the sun. But every day, the fields grew greener. Every dawn brought new life. Sprouts unfolding, leaves stretching, blossoms trembling in the breeze. The world was reminding them of something winter had nearly made them forget. Life always returns, and in that truth lay both comfort and courage. For with every seed planted, every furrow carved, and every sunrise greeted, the villagers declared proudly and wordlessly, "We will endure again." As the last heat of summer softened, a subtle shift swept through the land. Mornings grew cooler. Dew gathered on rooftops like scattered pearls. Leaves tinged with hints of yellow and red, as if the trees were testing their autumn colors before committing fully. The sky settled into deeper shades of blue, washed clean of summer haze. Autumn had arrived, quiet at first, but unmistakable. For the medieval villagers, autumn wasn't a season of rest. It was a season of reckoning. Everything they had done since spring, the planting, the tending, the endless hours in the sun, now stood before them in the form of heavy granaries, stacked hayricks, and baskets overflowing with fruit. The harvest had been brought in. The earth had given its verdict. Now it was time to prepare for the next great battle, winter. Fields were cleared and combed meticulously. Tools were cleaned, sharpened, and stored. Houses underwent repairs, cracks stuffed with straw, shutters reinforced, roofs patched. Firewood was gathered obsessively. Entire families hauled logs from the forest, stacking them in tall, symmetrical towers that looked almost like monuments to survival. Smoke returned to the skies. It curled from chimneys in thin gray ribbons, a reminder that the warmth of summer had passed and that the hearth was once again the heart of the home. Inside, cauldrons simmered with soups thickened by the harvest bounty. Herbs hung drying from rafters, scenting the air with sage, rosemary, and thyme. Autumn was a paradox, both comforting and foreboding. On one hand, it was a season of abundance. On the other, it was a countdown to deprivation. Still, there was beauty everywhere. Trees erupted in brilliant color, amber, crimson, gold. The forest became living paintings. Leaves tumbled from the branches like slow-moving flames. Children leaped into piles of them, shrieking with delight. Hunters ventured into the woods with renewed purpose, tracking deer through rustling canopies. The countryside felt alive in a way it hadn't since spring. But as the leaves began to fall faster, as winds grew sharper, as sunlight faded earlier each evening, a familiar tension seeped into the village. People began to measure their supplies with nervous calculation. They rechecked food stores, counted jars, inspected grain sacks for signs of pests. Every detail mattered, because everyone knew what lay ahead. The first frost arrived unannounced, glittering on rooftops. Crops left in the fields curled and blackened overnight. The ponds formed thin, fragile skin. The season had turned decisively. Winter was approaching. But before the cold fully claimed the land, there was one last burst of joy, the autumn feasts. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, thick stews, and baked apples dripping with honey. Villagers celebrated with all the energy they had left. Musicians played lively tunes. Children danced in circles. Elders watched with tired, contented smiles, remembering the many seasons they had survived. It was a final moment of brightness before the long dark. Stories were shared, tales of ancient harvests, of gods and spirits, of ancestors who had carved life out of even harsher lands. Toasts were raised to the year's successes and to the hope that the coming winter would be merciful. But beneath the laughter, people glanced toward the horizon, where the wind carried an unmistakable chill. The land was quieting. Animals moved differently, slower, more deliberate. Nights lengthened by minutes each day. And when the first real snowfall dusted the ground in a soft white hush, everyone understood. The season of survival had begun again. Yet the villagers did not face it with fear alone. They faced it with preparation, unity, and the quiet confidence built from generations of endurance. Winter could come. They were ready. Winter returned like a familiar shadow, slow at first, then all at once. The wind sharpened, slicing through the trees with a cold so precise it felt almost intentional. Snow drifted from the sky in soft flakes that soon thickened into blankets, covering rooftops, fields, and roads in silent white. The world grew quiet. Paths disappeared. Voices softened. Life retreated indoors. For medieval villagers, winter was not simply a season. It was an adversary they had spent all year preparing to meet. Every log stacked, every jar sealed, every grain stored had been done for this moment. Now came the time to test those preparations. Inside their homes, fires roared with purpose. Sparks leapt up chimneys like tiny stars fleeing into the cold. Families gathered around the hearth, the heat a precious shield against the winter's bite. Meals became simpler. Thick porridge, salted meats, root vegetables baked until soft, but they were enough. They had to be. Still, the cold found ways to seep in. Drafts whispered through every crack, sliding beneath doors, chilling bare floors. People slept huddled together for warmth. Breath rose like smoke in the air. Water froze inside buckets. The simplest tasks, fetching wood, tending animals, breaking ice for water, became battles fought daily. But amid the hardship, a strange kind of peace settled over the village. With the fields buried, with the workload minimal, life slowed. People talked more, told stories, mended clothes, repaired tools, played simple games by firelight. Children carved small toys from scraps of wood. Elders shared tales of winters long past, legends of bravery, loss, and survival that had shaped their people for centuries. Outside, the world was transformed. Trees bowed beneath heavy snow, their branches like white sculptures. Frozen rivers glinted in the moonlight, smooth as polished glass. Footprints left in the drifts vanished within hours, swallowed by the relentless wind. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing across the cold landscape like lonely, ancient songs. But beauty did not erase danger. The cold could kill. So could hunger. So could sickness. Every cough drew worried glances. Every empty pantry shelf brought fear. Every storm that raged outside their walls was a reminder of the thin line between survival and tragedy. Yet even in the harshest nights, the villagers held onto a quiet resilience. They had faced winter before. Their parents had faced it. Their ancestors had carved life from frozen earth long before any village walls existed. They trusted in their preparation. They trusted in each other. And they trusted in the ancient rhythm of the world. As days passed, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Weeks blurred together. The cold deepened. But then, slowly, very slowly, changes began to appear. The snow softened. Icicles dripped. Birds chirped faintly in the distance. Tiny signs, almost too small to believe. But the villagers noticed. They always noticed. It was the first whisper of the seasons turning. And then came the day when the air felt different, still cold, but with a softness beneath it, like velvet hidden under steel. The fires burned a little lower. The wind lost its razor edge. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip. People stepped outside, blinking into the pale sunlight. They brushed snow off tools. They checked barns. They looked toward their fields, imagining them green again. Hope rose quietly, carefully, like a seed beneath the soil waiting for warmth. Because every villager knew this truth, etched into their bones by generations of survival. No winter lasts forever. And so, with a mixture of relief and determination, they prepared themselves, not for rest, but for the return of work, life, and the endless cycle of seasons that defined their world. Spring was on its way. As winter slowly weakened, the land itself seemed to inhale for the first time in months. The icy crust that had locked the world in silence began to crack. Water dripped from rooftops in steady rhythms, carving paths through layers of snow. The sun lingered a little longer in the sky each day, warming the frozen earth with gentle, tentative light. Spring was not here yet, but its footsteps echoed everywhere. Villagers emerged from their homes with a cautious sort of hope. They tested the softened ground with their boots. They inspected tools that had sat idle since autumn. They peered into barns, counting animals, calculating supplies, and imagining the work soon to come. The cold was still present, but its authority was slipping. Inside the homes, the mood changed too. People spoke more eagerly. Fires burned less fiercely. Children shed a layer of wool. Meals began to include the last preserved berries and the final handfuls of stored herbs, small reminders of the world preparing to bloom again. But before spring arrived fully, there was one more challenge to face. The most unpredictable stretch of the entire year. The thaw. The thaw brought mud, sickness, sudden storms, and unpredictable floods. Roads turned into sludge. Rivers swelled with treacherous force. Roofs collapsed under melting snow. For all its promise, the thaw was a dangerous transition. Neither winter nor spring, but something unstable in between. Still, for the villagers, even danger was welcome if it meant the end of winter. Birdsong returned in hesitant notes. Migrating flocks streaked across the sky. Herd animals grew restless, sensing the shift. Trees trembled with the first internal stirrings of sap. Small green buds appeared on branches, shy but determined. The world was waking up, and with it came the most sacred ritual of medieval life, the beginning of the agricultural year. Plows were dragged out from storage, their metal edges polished to a shine. Harnesses were repaired. Oxen were fed heartier meals in preparation for the heavy work ahead. Families inspected seed stores with reverence. Each seed held the fragile possibility of survival. The first day of plowing was almost a ceremony. People gathered at the fields before dawn. Frost sparkled across the earth in silver patterns. Breath rose in white clouds. Then, as the sun climbed, the first furrow was cut, deep, dark, and promising. A cheer often rose from the villagers, not loud, but full of relief. The earth had opened. Life could begin again. Days grew longer. Work grew harder. But the exhaustion felt different now, warmer, more hopeful. Sweat was no longer a misery, but a reassurance. Tools clattered. Animals strained in their harnesses. Voices echoed across the valleys as farmers called instructions, encouragement, and sometimes curses into the air. Children carried water. Women sowed seeds in careful rows. Everyone had a part to play. Spring was labor, not leisure, but it was joyful labor. Each new sprout brought victory. Each new leaf felt like a blessing. Each morning of sunlight felt like a gift reclaimed from the cold. And yet, beneath the excitement lingered the constant awareness of unpredictability. Spring storms could ruin weeks of work. Late frost could kill young shoots. Pests could appear without warning. A season of life was also a season of risk. But that was the rhythm of their world, a rhythm older than memory. Hope, fear, joy, work, survival. Year after year, generation after generation. And so they welcomed spring with open hands and grateful hearts, knowing well that nature gave nothing easily, but gave everything generously when respected. In those first warm breezes, in the trembling green fields, in the return of birdsong, the villagers were reminded of a simple truth. Survival was not only endurance, it was renewal. As spring settled fully onto the land, its early tremors of life grew into a sweeping, unstoppable surge. The world no longer hinted at renewal, it burst with it. Trees unfurled fresh leaves in vibrant greens. Meadows rippled like living oceans. Streams rushed with clarity and speed, singing against smooth stones. Everywhere, life multiplied. For the medieval villagers, this was the most exhilarating and exhausting time of the year. The fields demanded constant attention. Rainfall patterns had to be read like scripture. Soil had to be checked for moisture, texture, pests. Seeds needed protection from birds and rodents. And every task had to be done at the right moment. Too early or too late, and the year's efforts could collapse. But despite the pressure, spring carried a kind of joy that made even the heaviest work feel purposeful. Children helped by chasing crows from the fields, waving sticks, and shouting triumphantly each time a bird fled. Young men hauled water from nearby streams. Women planted vegetable gardens near their homes, arranging neat rows of onions, carrots, beans, and herbs. Elders supervised, their sharp eyes missing nothing, guiding younger hands with calm authority. In the evenings, after long days of labor, families gathered outside their homes to enjoy the soft twilight. They sat on wooden stools or stone steps, letting the cool breeze wash over sun-warmed skin. Laughter came easily. Stories flowed. Instruments were played. It was a rare moment of both rest and connection with a world that was rapidly blooming. But spring also marked a shift in society. Travelers returned to the roads. Markets reopened. Pilgrims passed through villages carrying tales from far lands, stories of foreign skies, unfamiliar crops, strange customs. These tales fascinated the villagers, whose world was shaped by the turning seasons and the boundaries of their countryside. News from beyond was a reminder that life stretched far beyond their fields. Trade flourished as well. Peddlers arrived with goods unavailable in winter. Bright-dyed cloth, iron tools, spices, needles, beads, salt, dried fruits, and even rare trinkets carved by distant hands. Villagers bartered eagerly, offering wool, grain, eggs, and crafted items in exchange. The village buzzed with renewed life. But beneath all the liveliness, a quiet understanding persisted. Spring could not be trusted blindly. For all its beauty, it was a fragile season. A single week of unexpected frost could destroy new shoots. A violent storm could flatten entire fields. Rains could turn roads to mud, isolating villages from each other. Every farmer kept one eye on the sky. Still, optimism blossomed as surely as the flowers. Confidence grew with the swelling buds and strengthening sun. People walked with lighter steps. Sleep came easier. Songs returned to lips that had been silent through winter. And then came the moment that every villager awaited with reverence. The first true bloom of the season. A single flower, bright, open, defiant, pushing up through the soil. It was a sign, a promise, almost a miracle. Children would pick them and bring them home proudly. Women would tuck them behind their ears. Men would pause in their work to admire them silently. That first bloom symbolized everything. Resilience, renewal, victory. And soon, the world erupted in blossoms. Orchards covered in delicate white and pink, gardens overflowing with color, hedges alive with buzzing bees. The air itself seemed sweetened. Livestock grew livelier as well. Calves stumbled through fields on unsteady legs. Lambs chased each other through tall grass. Chickens pecked energetically at the soft earth. Goats climbed anything they could. Life was expanding in every direction. Yet nature's generosity came with a message. It was time to prepare for the next stage. The villagers sharpened tools, checked granaries, strengthened fences, because with spring's abundance came the inevitable approach of summer, a season of heat, storms, and hard work. But they welcomed it. For after surviving winter's cruelty and navigating spring's uncertainty, summer felt like a reward. In the rising warmth, in the swelling fields, in the laughter that drifted across the countryside, the villagers felt something ancient and powerful, hope turning into reality. As summer ripened into its final stretch, the world seemed to hold its breath. Fields, heavy with grain, swayed in slow, deliberate motions, as if aware of the immense responsibility they carried. The air thickened with the scent of warm earth, crushed grass, and ripening fruit. Even the birds fell quieter, their songs softened into patient anticipation. It was the calm before the storm of human labor. For the villagers, every glance toward the golden fields stirred the same thought. Harvest was no longer coming. Harvest was here. The first day of reaping began before sunrise. A faint blue glow brushed the horizon when the villagers, tools in hand, assembled like soldiers preparing for battle. Scythes glimmered in the half-light. Sickles hung at belts. Baskets and carts stood ready. The chief farmer, often the oldest and wisest among them, walked the edge of the field, testing the grain between calloused fingers. Only after his silent approval did the work begin. And when it began, it was relentless. Scythes swept in wide arcs, slicing through stalks with rhythmic swishes. The sound was hypnotic, steady, harsh, alive. Workers moved in rows, forming an unbroken line of effort. Behind them came the binders, tying the cut stalks into sheaves. Behind the binders, carts rolled in, pulled by oxen straining under the heat. Sweat ran freely. Shirts clung to skin. Hands blistered and bled. But no one slowed. Harvest time was unforgiving. A sudden storm could ruin entire fields. Wind could scatter grain. Animals could invade. There was no margin for delay, no luxury of rest. Children carried water, their small arms trembling under the weight of clay jugs. Women gathered fallen stalks, repaired broken tools, and organized food to keep the workers going. Elders moved along the edges of the field, offering advice, spotting weak points in the rows, guiding the younger ones with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. The days blurred under the hammering sun. Morning broke with quiet determination. Midday throbbed with heat and exhaustion. Evening arrived with aching muscles and aching hearts. Night fell with relief, but only briefly, for dawn would arrive again too soon. Yet amid the exhaustion, there was pride, a powerful, sustaining pride. Each bundle tied, each cart filled, each section cleared brought a rush of accomplishment. The villagers could see, in tangible form, the reward for their year-long struggle. The barns filled, the granaries swelled. The village's future, its survival, took shape before their eyes. Then, as the final swath of grain fell, the exhaustion melted into celebration. Harvest feasts erupted across the countryside. Long tables were laid with bread, roasted meats, cheese wheels, fresh berries, and the first jugs of new ale. Bonfires crackled. Musicians plucked lively melodies. Children danced wild circles around the flames. Couples stole away into the shadows. Laughter rose into the cool evening air, a triumphant exhale after weeks of punishing work. This celebration was more than joy. It was gratitude. It was relief. It was a declaration. We have won again. But even in their joy, the villagers knew the cycle wasn't over. Now came the task of storing, preserving, planning. Grain had to be dried. Root vegetables had to be dug and packed. Fruit had to be pressed, dried, or fermented. Tools needed repair before winter's dormancy. Autumn loomed on the horizon. Beautiful, yes, but also heavy with responsibility. The fields, now empty, looked peaceful, but the barns, filled to their ceilings, looked powerful. The villagers carried this strength inside them as they stepped into the next season. They had bent their backs, blistered their hands, and burned beneath the sun, all to defend themselves against the winter waiting just beyond the turning leaves. But they had done it. They had filled their stores. They had secured their survival. And with that certainty, the villagers moved into autumn with steady hearts, ready for the next chapter in the eternal cycle of life, labor, and endurance. And so the year completed its great turning, as it had for countless generations before. Autumn arrived with its familiar whisper, a soft, golden breath across the land. Leaves blazed in brilliant hues before descending like embers to the earth. The villagers moved through fields now stripped bare, their bodies sore, but their spirits lifted by the bounty they had secured. They patched roofs one last time, sealed grain bins, salted meat, fortified walls, and prepared every corner of their homes for the cold that would soon descend. The smell of smoke, apples, dried herbs, and fresh cut would fill the village, drifting out through open windows and chimney tops. Life slowed, sharpened, steadied. The sky darkened earlier. Nights grew longer. Frost clung to every surface. Animals huddled closer together. Footsteps crunched on the first thin layers of ice. The world was inching back toward winter's embrace. But this time, the villagers were not afraid. They had worked. They had survived. They had enough. And with enough, even winter lost some of its teeth. When the first real snow fell, heavy, quiet, glowing in the torchlight, the villagers didn't greet it with dread, but with acceptance. They knew the cycle. They honored it. They belonged to it as much as it belonged to them. Inside their warm, firelit homes, families gathered closely. Meals were simple but nourishing. Laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent just months before. Stories were told and retold. Legends of ancestors, tales of gods and heroes, memories of winters far harsher than this one. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining themselves as the heroes of future stories. The cold deepened. Winds howled. Snow piled high. But inside those humble homes, life burned bright. The villagers had inherited not just their traditions, but their ancestors' resilience, an unbroken chain of strength passed down through centuries. Each generation endured the same seasons, the same hardships, the same cycles of death and renewal. And with each passing year, the world reminded them of the same eternal truth. Life is fragile, but human spirit is not. When the winter reached its darkest point, when the nights were longest and the cold most unforgiving, the villagers gathered for their oldest ritual. They lit a single flame in each home, a symbol of endurance, a promise whispered through time. Spring will return. And it did. Slowly, steadily, inevitably. Ice cracked. Snow thinned. Birds returned. The earth softened. Seeds awoke underground. Children shed their heavy layers. Doors opened again. Fields stirred with life. The cycle renewed itself. The world exhaled. The villagers stepped forward. Stronger. Wiser. Still standing. Because that was the true heart of their story. Not the cold they faced, nor the hunger they feared, nor the labor that bent their backs, but the unshakable perseverance that carried them through each turning season. They lived, worked, celebrated, endured, and hoped in rhythm with the earth itself. And as long as they listened to that ancient rhythm, as long as they honored the cycle, they would survive every winter that ever came. For in the turning of the seasons, they found not just hardship, but meaning. And in that meaning, they found life.